The story of the Battle of Los Angeles would show significant signs of space without citing the attack at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, which is found on the island of Oahu, Hawaii, was taken by the US from the Kingdom of Hawaii through the 1875 Reciprocity Treaty. It had a superficial passageway. However, the US government's interests in it expanded due to several trading activities in the area. Fast forward to the 7th day of December 1941. The base was invaded by Japanese Navy planes and small-sized submarines. The Japanese military had named this invasion as Operation I. For Japan, the motive behind the invasion was fourfold. First, a form of preventative measure to stop the US fleet from crushing its already planned military tactics. Second, it was staged to buy time to strengthen its position and naval capacity. Third, to break America's ability to line up its defense units in the Pacific Fleet. And lastly, the attack was planned to weaken the American pride and to make the US government plead for an agreement of peace. Weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, so many United States citizens reckoned that an enemy invasion on US soil is a possible feat. Back then, in 1941, there were certain rumors of fast approaching enemy aircraft, and this had created great unrest amongst the people. With this development, stock prices crumbled severely. Great pressure mounting, tension rising, and panic swept all over the terrains as the rumors of incoming Japanese submarines and warships were being communicated. The situation only went from bad to worse when the Secretary of War for the United States, Harry Stimson, gave a stern warning that American soil should brace up for possible enemy invasion at any point in time. Later on the 23rd of February 1942, a submarine owned by the Japanese was spotted on the shore of Santa Barbara, California, with several cannon bombs hurled at a refinery. This was the first time that the United States landmass had been attacked that way in the World War II era. The next day, lots of uneasy feelings and battle readiness fueled the remarkable events of the war. February 24, 1942, towards sunset, it all began as the Naval Defense Centers on the shore of California gave orders to all units to brace up for possible invasion from the enemy, the Japanese. However, there was peace in the air for some hours. Then, in the early hours of the next day, February 25th, the military units spotted an enemy group west of Los Angeles. Immediately, sirens were all over, and in no time, it was blackout all throughout the city as the peace slowly began to wane. Swinging into action, military personnel had stationed anti-aircraft firearms and flooded the atmosphere with massive searchlights. Some minutes after 3 a.m., there were gunshots all over. Heeding to the reports of the unknown object up in the air, the Santa Monica forces released a cannon of anti-aircraft and fireballs from the machine guns. Not too long after, support came from the other city defense units. The Los Angeles Times put in these words: "Special searchlights from several stations flooded the air with heavy probings, as anti-aircraft artillery filled the space with heavy explosions and shrapnel." The peace once enjoyed drastically turned to unrest as Los Angeles was under enemy invasion. Still, all those curiously set their gaze up to the sky were only able to see smoke and the somewhat glowing fireball from the military artillery. Yes, human intuition would probably have identified all kinds of shapes up in the air during the fused harmony of color and noise, but the defense units would likely have a different story to tell as there were no apparent difference in the content of the sky. For most, it was a real and severe threat on American soil as all kinds of reports were received portraying enemy invasion. The shootings wore on for more than an hour. At a minute, the final instruction, all clear, was pronounced in the morning. Los Angeles artillery had released more than 1,400 turns of their ammunition into the air. Daylight broke, and the military forces uncovered that there seemed to have been no invasion from the enemy. However, several contradictory reports were collected and then fact-checked. There were no bombs discovered or planes even close. From the statement issued by the Defense Command, damages made were not from any visible enemy, but in-house shots. Shrapnel thundered down all over the city, causing major damages to some properties. Although there were no severe injuries to the body amidst the shootings, 5 people, according to the report, lost their lives. 3 as a result of car accidents during the uproar, and 2 other persons suffered a heart attack during the long hours of a blackout. Reports of the events conveniently occupied the first page in the news all over the country. The next few days saw the press and government releasing conflicting statements about the incident, which later was titled The Battle of Los Angeles. Just to give you a taste of the conflicting reports, Frank Knox, the then Secretary of the Navy, claimed it was a wrong call fueled by fear-filled imaginations. But for Harry Stimson, Secretary of War, it was a different story. Stimson proposed that these ghost fighters were probably aircraft controlled by the enemy to instill fear and worry in the minds of the people. General George C. Marshall had the same thoughts. Although Stimson withdrew his statements at a much later time, a lot of people, civilians in their thousands, who hold on to the fact that they saw aircraft gathered up in the air in Los Angeles, still feel convinced that it wasn't a false alarm. There are several other assumptions and beliefs about the strange incident. To some, it's a well-staged occurrence. Others, a highly exaggerated scenario. Be it as it may, some editorial and media outlets see it as an experience to cover up the truth. Reportedly, from the statement issued in the New York Times, the witnesses were said to have scouted a large object, like a floating balloon. In the same vein, some other people claim to have seen lots of planes. The further occurrence in the early hours of February 25, 1942 is looked into, the more remarkable it unfolds. The actual cause of the Battle of Los Angeles is still a question running through the minds of people today. This was what the Japanese had to say. Japanese military units insisted that they didn't fly any aircraft whatsoever across the city during the Second World War. This has only opened the remarkable event to diverse speculation, like contradictions in the governmental body, conflict of theories among civilians, and a host of other things. Hey, if you liked the video so far, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more stuff. But the practical description for the incident is that some gunshot-loving military personnel and primitive scouting systems teamed up to create a wrong signal. Before we move further, did the Japanese indeed cause the Battle of Los Angeles? We can't say for sure, but if you asked if they had plans against the US, then the response would be in the affirmative. For centuries, the Japanese had hardly suffered any perceivable defeat, so they had no words like surrender in their vocabulary. Yes, the government of Japan had doubts about defeating America, but it longed for a favorable compromise. They had so much strategy and hope that by invading Pearl Harbor, which they did, they could buy quality time in building their arsenal. Of course, this was a wise tactic as it would impede the US intervention. Afterwards, the Japanese government had planned a robust war that would undoubtedly leave the United States defense system battered and weakened. This way, they would have no other choice but to settle for an agreement of peace, which will grant the emperor and their military defenses the utmost authority and power. With a tactical government and skilled military force, the Japanese rightly predicted the United States' actions. Counting the loss in the Battle of the Mariana Islands and the one in the Philippine Sea in 1944, the Japanese uncovered that final and robust battle would probably be fought on the islands. In the first month of the year 1945, Japan's highest power correctly predicted the actions and the intentions of the United States, and, of course, commenced plans and preparations for it adequately. Their strategists correctly foresaw that the United States would invade two of their islands, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. At Okinawa, the Japanese government had a strong resistance team, of which they believed would demand a compromise of peace. Considering the calculations of the US fighting aircraft range, the Japanese predicted the exact spot of landing would be at Kyushu. After Kyushu, the Japanese strategist indicated that the United States would endeavor to stage an assault on Tokyo. Finally, the Japanese government predicted the last battle on the island of Getsugo. How did the Japanese government plan to counter the predicted attacks? This is it. The idea was to crush the US vessels before they even got to shore. With this in mind, they had prepared approximately 5,000 additional planes and a host of suicide automobiles. The Japanese government didn't stop there. They had in their arsenal frogmen wired with bombs and were ready to die along with the invaders for the good of their native land, Japan. In a situation whereby the enemy scaled through and got to the beach, they had the great military force to deal with. As expected, these men were ever ready to fight until the last drop of blood. To boost their chances, common men were enlisted in the battle team to fight beside trained soldiers with their pointed spears made of bamboo. As an example of civilians recruited into the military force, the Japanese government cited exemplary, commendable, and patriotic actions of the civilians of Saipan. They chose to jump the hills instead of throwing their hands up in surrender to the enemy. Writer of the story Downfall, Richard B. Frank, described the stand of the Japanese at Getsugo. With what they had prepared, they could utterly crush about a third of the enemy before they got to shore. Considering how the general himself, George Marshall, shivered when he witnessed the lineup of defense systems the Japanese had in place, it will be true that the government of Japan had great hope that they would get something more significant than to throw up their hands and surrender to the enemy. Moving further to the happenings surrounding the remarkable event titled the Battle of Los Angeles, in 1983, findings showed that meteorological balloons were pumped out before the barrage for their determination of climatic conditions. The Office of Air Force History uncovered this. Light and colors could have been responsible for triggering effects. The moment the gunshots started, the disturbing mixture of smoke, massive searchlights, and other factors may have presented a false enemy plane, causing a make-believe enemy invasion when there was absolutely nothing. Yes, the Battle of Los Angeles could have probably been an illusion, considering the tons of theories against it, but one thing is for sure. It is the cold, hard indication of how a Japanese invasion was feared by many Americans within the West Coast. The Japanese, at a much later time, devised various means to invade American soil. Some of these measures are the release of thousands of bomb-carved fireballs. Also, Japanese submarines proceeded with their periodic attacks against the United States during the Second World War. To hit warships, Japanese submarines sank a good number of ships, aside from the little invasions on the coast. Some of these invasions were 2 consecutive air invasions in a bid to begin forest fires in the southwestern part of Oregon, strike on a lighthouse on the island of Vancouver, and the barrage of Fort Stevens along the Columbia River. Still, none of these schemes and plots reduced the height of total and uncontrollable uproar felt during the Battle of Los Angeles on February 25th, 1942. At that time, several reporters stated that it was suiting that the strange incident occurred in Hollywood, the heart of the movie industry. The New York Times stated in one of their published articles in 1942 that Hollywood seemed to have stood as a location of a great battle that was just an illusion. To close the curtain, despite the contradictory theories and beliefs, the Battle of Los Angeles remains an unforgettable event in the history of America. That's it for today. If you enjoyed it, please leave us a like, subscribe, and be sure to hit the bell icon so you can see when we get new videos out. As for now, y'all have a good one.